All right, and welcome to our lesson on how to annotate a poem. Thank you again for coming to the lesson earlier, and this is the part that we weren't able to do in the live session. So when we encounter poetry, we have two ways of approaching it. You can read poetry for the emotion and the feelings that it makes you get, or, and this is more common in like an English class, you can analyze poetry for the deeper meaning and try to understand the message that the poet is giving to you. Personally, I really like poetry for the sake of poetry and just feeling the feels that it gives me. But as an English teacher, I do also like to understand it for the message and analyze the poem. So that's my second way of reading a poem. So I'm going to teach you today a couple ways of how to actually annotate a poem. So when you are looking at a poem and looking at it from a close reading, you want to think about the key images and words and the way that the poem's written that stands out to you. You should also be analyzing your poem probably around the third or fourth reading. The first time you read a poem, read it for meaning, for feeling, how does it make you feel? Second time to kind of clarify any questions, and then the third time you can start to analyze it and think about what's actually going on. So we're going to look at some of the important things that are in this poem, and I'm going to assume that you have already read it, so I'm not going to read it to you, and I'm going to assume that this is your third or fourth time reading this poem. So when I'm reading a poem, I want to think about different things that stand out to me. So first of all, one of the things that does stand out to me is this whole idea of this phrase that's repeated. I'm not. Okay, those are the first phrases that are repeated. Second phrases that are repeated, we have other. And we see it again, other. Okay, and then the poem shifts a little bit more, but we want to pay attention to the different types of words and repetition that stands out. So we can tell that there's a shift in sort of the idea and the story that's being shared in this poem just by the shift in the repetitiveness. So I'm not versus other. And so we can also see the first thing that happens in this poem. Ooh, you can't see that at all. Let's see if I can do a different color. Let's do orange. So we're not, just kidding. So this first part of the poem, there's a shift in tone. So when I'm annotating it, I'm just going to circle that. And because I wrote it in orange, I'm just going to put here. And I'm going to actually write it with this pen because it's easier to write with this. So, oops. So I'm going to say tone shift. And the first part of the first tone I would say is sarcastic. And then we have our second tone, and then I would use a different color. And that's kind of this part. And this is more of a defiant. And then you would want to find words that show defiance. So I can see it right here. Damn you. So let's just talk a little bit about what he's saying in this first paragraph and what purpose he's trying to get, this first part of it. So this first actual half of the poem, he's talking about different stereotypes that exist to describe Indigenous people. He talks about kind of like a simplistic, natural person in the first one. The second one, there are lots of words that have to do with movies. So we've got video store, literally movies, rewind. So we can tell that that one has to do with the TV trope. And then the last stereotype that he goes into is thinking about the Indigenous person as like a savage. That is a trope that you will see over and over again in people writing or creating this character. And we know that he's talking about this because of the words that he uses: pungent, piercing eye, a startling yell, and friendly kind. All of those relate back to this idea of an Indigenous person as a savage. And he's saying in this first part with the tone, I am not these things. And he's saying that on behalf of, I think, other people that have experienced this as well. And he says, you have these tropes about who Indigenous people are, and that is not who we are. And that shifts us to the next part of this poem, where he talks about what we should be thinking about Indigenous people. And literally, he gives a description of almost any single person that you could meet just down the street. So he's essentially saying that, like, Indigenous people are just like you. You know, we don't fit into these tropes that you have created for us. We are just normal people. And so why are you putting us into these boxes that don't actually exist? And he describes a bunch of different types of people that could be literally anybody. He makes some allusions to Oka, Ipperwash. These are both land disputes. He talks about Wounded Knee, which is when there was the massacre of 300 Lakota people by U.S. soldiers. He talks about... And then he moves into another more aggressive tone. Okay, and we can see that he is upset by the different stereotypes. And he says, damn you, so the people that have put these tropes on him, but he also says, damn me for not being bold. And so he says, we can assume that he wishes that he had stood up to these stereotypes. There's another allusion here. Monsanto. This is an allusion to a chemical company that has genetically engineered crops. And we can assume that that allusion has to do with something such as colonizers changing the land to which they come to. There's a really great video and it has Saskatchewan ties, so you guys should watch it. And he talks about how in the end, maybe it won't really matter. The land doesn't care, whereas people do. Okay. He then talks about how, okay, so maybe the land's going to fall apart, but they didn't make the mess. We didn't make it. It's been passed on to us by colonizers. And then he also talks about how the people have learned the lessons of the colonizers and they've learned to play the games. Okay. And then he moves on to sort of our third tone here. And I would call this tone maybe melancholic. You know, he thinks about when all the world is warm and dead. He wonders how things might have been had you followed. So again, this is talking about the colonizers and we had led. So he wonders how would life have been different if we had followed a more Indigenous worldview. And he makes the case that Indigenous groups live under this philosophy of 7 generations, which means that just the decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world for 7 generations into the future. Wow, my mouth stopped working there. Which ties back to the whole idea of Monsanto. So then I would just draw an arrow back to that and be like, Monsanto does not follow the philosophies of 7 generations. And so he recognizes that it's not easy, and this is the melancholic thing, to maybe change our worldview to become more like this 7 generations philosophy. And he recognizes that people are probably not going to do that. Because he says, you can go back and ask the brave that you like so much. So now this is referencing back to the first part of this poem. the tropes or the stereotypes. And he says, maybe you can ask that person to help you save the world. So he's recognizing that in the end, because of the colonization of North America, the world, if we continue this way, is not going to survive. And he realizes that they're probably not going to come ask him. And so again, we're going back to this whole sarcastic tone. Because this person, we already know, doesn't exist. He's made up by colonizers. Okay. And he ends the line ends the poem with a really powerful line saying, I can't. And now I want you guys to think about, why would he have said that? What is he trying to say to the people that he's telling this poem to? Why is he telling them that he can't solve this problem for them? And what's the purpose of that? So a couple things I want you guys to think about. Is this a hopeful poem? What can we learn from it? What are some keywords and phrases that stood out to you? And to remember, when you're annotating, you should be doing it with a pen or paper, a bunch of different pens and pencils. You should be writing all over your paper. It should end up looking like this. You should have questions on it. You should be saying things. Why does he write this? What does this mean? I really like this line. Interacting with the poem, because that is the best way that you're going to come to your understandings. And sometimes we're going to have open-ended questions. I read this poem and I've read it many times, and sometimes I still have questions saying, what does he mean by that? And that's the point of poetry as well, is to say, what is the purpose of this? So I hope this helps you out. I'll see you guys at our next lesson.